Welcome to this space. It is beautiful to see all of you in here together. My name is Claire Nicholson-Hurtig. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the Education for Liberation Collective. Just to set some good energy for us in the room, I just wanted to start us off with a little chant. So could I get a free, free Palestine? Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Free, free Palestine. Beautiful. Amazing. Thank you. It feels good, doesn't it, to scream? So yeah. Yes, we are all screaming internally. I'm aware. So welcome to everybody. We are gathered here tonight for this magical event. I'm going to ask Connor to go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to try to move away from the mic so I'm not making those noises. Can you all still hear me without the breathy? No, you can't? Okay. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, I'll try to just talk like this and not make those noises. Is that better? Yeah? Okay, I'm going to do my best. Okay, so we have the plan for what we're going to do together tonight. I'm going to share some logistical info. We're going to have a brief introduction, locating us in this space and on this land. We're going to have a chance to just do a 5-minute check-in with each other. If you've been to an Education for Liberation event before, you know that we like to give a chance to people, not just to hear from the front, but to talk to each other so that we can build community and know each other. Then we'll have the panel discussion. I'm going to have a conversation with our 3 magical speakers. I'll ask them 3 questions. They will all respond. They will probably respond to each other as well. And then after that, we'll have a chance for discussion among y'all. We'll give you a couple questions to chat about in small groups, so whoever is around you. After that, we'll come back for a Q&A. We have about 30 minutes booked for that. Pardon me. And then for the closing, usually the end of event, it's kind of a like footnotes, like, okay, bye, we heard what we wanted to hear. For us, it's actually a really important moment because the education that we're hoping to help people engage in, if it's actual, popular community-based education, we want it to lead to some action that we can all take. So at the end, we'll have the opportunity just to consider the paths for action that you hopefully received the handout when you came in. If you didn't, we will get them to you, and folks can consider what they want to do as actions with the knowledge gathered this evening. All right, next slide, please. Isn't it pretty? Okay, so Education for Liberation Collective, we just wanted to let you know who we are. Out of curiosity, folks here tonight, who had heard of Education for Liberation before this event? Okay, cool. Good to have some fans. And if you didn't, that's cool too. Basically, we formed last fall. We want to offer popular education on radical topics, help people understand, better understand, because people already have an understanding for sure, but better understand power, how it works, how we can actually build power as regular people as well. And also, we want to create community spaces like this one for people to come together. This is our 3rd event. Our previous ones, our first one was here as well. It was about Canadian complicity in Israeli apartheid. Just a little check if anybody attended that one, either here or online. Yeah, cool, nice, nice. And then we also had one in March about the overdose crisis at Tom Brown Arena. Anybody go to that one? Yeah, cool. And the amazing Marina was the facilitator of that. She's over there. Yes. All right. Okay. We wanted to mention at the start briefly why we require masks at our events. So I'll just outline it briefly for folks, but I will take a sip of water before I do that. So despite the efforts of many people to protect our collective health and well-being in our capitalist and increasingly fascist society, political and corporate leaders have basically chosen profits and individual gain over protecting our collective health and well-being. This choice by those in power has led to more people getting infected, contracting long COVID, and or dying of this illness. It has also meant that many of those who are most vulnerable to respiratory illnesses can't participate in a lot of public spaces because they can't risk the chance of getting infected with a respiratory illness. So we deeply value gathering in person. We believe this is essential to building community and to building the trust that we need to build movements that can create transformational change. At the same time, we think it's important to care for one another amid the ongoing spread of respiratory illnesses. Our goal is to help protect ourselves and the people around us who may be at higher risk of severe infection by COVID-19 and other respiratory viruses and bacteria like RSV, the flu, measles, which has made a comeback in Ontario. In the spaces we create, we aim to minimize as much as we can the possibility of anyone getting sick or becoming disabled by long COVID because they contracted an illness at our event. Seeing other radical leftist groups take this measure has inspired us to explain why we do it as well, because we just thought we wanted to share that with y'all. So another, yeah, okay. Some appreciation for masking. Okay. Tonight, the speakers will remove their masks when speaking, but otherwise we ask that folks keep it on. If you need to take a sip of a drink or eat some food, please just go out to the main entryway area so that we can keep the seal, so to speak, as best we can in this room. So these are all small things we can do to care for each other, and this is all part of building the world that we want that does not tolerate genocide in any of its forms, right? We're also streaming this event. Welcome to the folks tuning in online. And thank you to Connor over here and Carlin, who's remotely helping out, holding it down online. If you want to access the recording, you can sign up to our email list because we'll be sending it out, or follow us on Instagram at Education for Liberation, education.for.liberation. Education for Liberation without the dots was already taken. So we will share it that way. If you need a washroom, directly to the left when you exit this room, that is where the washrooms are. Name tags. You'll notice that we gave folks name tags when they arrived. This is both to help us get to know each other, but also to help us foster respect for the use of any pronouns anyone who's participating tonight would prefer to be used when we talk to them or about them. There's also no obligation to include your pronouns on your name tag if that is not your jam. We've got two photographers here tonight, Anik and Matt. They will be taking photos and we will be doing like photo posts and stuff. If you do not want to be in the photos that we share for this event, we've got little stickers with a little X on them that you can put on so that we can make sure not to share any photos of you. If you need one and didn't manage to grab one, feel free to pop out, or we can get somebody to, you can raise your hand and we can get someone to hand them to you. Alternatively, you can also flag us down at the end just to make sure that we know that you don't want to be photographed. And we understand there's lots of reasons why that folks don't want to be in photos. So really no problem. And the last thing to mention is that probably won't happen, but should there be a situation where someone's trying to, in bad faith, disrupt the event, we've got a couple of folks here ready to intervene calmly and de-escalate the situation. Likely won't happen, but we just wanted to be ready if it did, because we want this space to be one where everybody can feel respected and safe, or as safe as we can try to be. So those are our logistical details for you. Thank you for listening. We will pass to the next part. Thank you, Connor. Okay, so no pride in genocide from Turtle Island to Palestine. Tonight we're here to learn about queer and trans solidarity with Palestine and the many layers of meaning behind the slogan, no pride in genocide. On these unceded, unsurrendered lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people, we have to anchor any discussion of genocide, apartheid, and occupation in an ongoing awareness that these colonial processes are also ongoing on the lands where we live. We must hold at the front of our minds the fact that our society is built on the same violent process of land theft, colonization, and genocide that we are seeing in Palestine. Through this murderous process, here and there, colonizing powers have violently imposed Western, heteropatriarchal, and capitalist institutions and white supremacist ideology. The institution where we are tonight, St. Paul University, was founded by the Congregation of the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, which is part of the Catholic Church. The Oblates operated 48 residential schools in Western and Northern Canada, at which 707 Oblate priests worked. The Indigenous people of these lands continue to fight for truth and justice. In December 2024, the Oblates signed an agreement with the National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation to enable researchers to access the personnel records of Oblate priests who worked at residential schools 2 years following their death, as opposed to only being able to access them 50 years after their death, which was the original protocol. So this is accelerated access that has been agreed to. The Oblates also agreed to fund a 1-year archivist position at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to help process the records. The truth must be understood so that there may be reparations, restitution, and actual genuine reconciliation based on the truth of the history of these lands. Tonight, let's also remember that here on Turtle Island and there in Palestine, with colonization came the imposition of Eurocentric concepts of gender and sexuality. For example, British colonizers imposed laws banning homosexual acts both on Turtle Island and in Palestine under the British mandate. By imposing patriarchal white supremacy, colonization has obscured and repressed the incredibly diverse ways that gender and sexuality can be expressed in Indigenous cultures. We can see one legacy of these colonial policies in the 231 calls to justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people issued in the inquiry report in 2019. Only 2, so that's 2 out of 231, have been completed. To ground us for the panel discussion, which we hope will help folks move to action, I want to share the words of renowned Michi Sagig Anishinaabeg feminist writer, academic, and musician, Leanne Bedesamosake Simpson. She has written about queerness and indigeneity, including in her compelling book, As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. The words I'm going to share with you are from the 2022 book, Rehearsals for Living, which Simpson co-wrote with Black abolitionist scholar and organizer Robin Maynard. Simpson's description of her Anishinaabeg ancestors' commitment to building life reminds me of how Palestinians and queer and trans people do the same. Oh, there we go. What I can learn from my ancestors, quote, what I can learn from my ancestors about, quote, Armageddon in effect, quote, as Public Enemy says, is that we world build anyway, as a practice, as a way of life. In the bush, my ancestors got up and built life every day, no matter what. They built life, even if it only lasted for a fraction of a second at the hands of the colonial death machine. They built it anyway, over and over, because they believed the practice of life building to be the essence of life and crucial for the generation of more life, or Mino Bima Diziwen. They knew that even if life was taken away from them, this practice of world building might still plant seeds for others, both human and non-human. This practice of collective world building might unlock knowledge that has the potential to nurture more than life-giving beginnings. This wisdom comes from the land. So wanted to share those words to connect what we're talking about tonight to the struggles on these lands. I think we're ready for a really amazing conversation. I'm going to introduce who we've got with us tonight. Then we're going to have a chance for y'all to check in with each other. And then after that, we'll get to the panel. So let's get their names up there on the next slide, please. Right, so we have with us next to me, Maria Fakhouri. Maria is a proud queer Palestinian psychotherapist, poet, and writer. That's a lot of alliteration. Proud queer Palestinian psychotherapist, poet, and writer. I guess psychotherapist, you don't pronounce the P, but anyway. She does work in local advocacy for Palestine, and she advocates online through her Instagram platform at mar._unfiltered. Yes, let's clap for each of them. Next to Maria, we have Natalie Kouri-Towe. Natalie is an associate professor of feminism and sexuality at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia University. Her research investigates the politics of solidarity under neoliberalism, with areas of focus ranging across responses to war in the Middle East, refugee crises, queer activism, and gender and sexuality pedagogies. Alongside her academic work, she has over 20 years of experience in activism, including campus and union organizing, popular education, and the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Maša Davidovic. She was born in Belgrade in the former Yugoslavia and lives here on occupied, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. She is an elected member of the national executive of her union, the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, CAPE, which represents about 28,000 public servants. Any CAPE members here tonight? Yeah, represent. She organizes across labor, Palestine solidarity, and queer and trans movements in Ottawa. Welcome, Maša. Right, moving along. If you could move to the next slide, my dear Connor. We asked folks when you registered what you know about the subject. Part of the work that we're doing is trying to find out where people are at and meet you and, as much as we can, do stuff that meets your interests and needs as folks who want to learn. Those who registered, we asked your knowledge level of this topic. Most people said medium. We have also some folks who said low, who are new to this subject. And then we have folks who said high, but most people said medium. Like any space with adults who are learning, we have a varying level of knowledge in the room. And we're going to have a great conversation that hopefully meets the needs of everybody. We also asked folks what they're most excited to learn about. We can't cover everything that folks mentioned, but we just want to share the themes of what people said. So folks are interested in learning about connections between the struggles and the connections to the larger fight against fascist, far-right, and authoritarian regimes. Folks are interested in supporting queer and trans Palestinians in Palestine and the diaspora. Folks wanted to learn about challenges and successes in building a more intersectional solidarity movement for Palestine and effective tactics or strategies in challenging pinkwashing. So these all really fit into what we're gonna have the conversation about, but we wanna just make sure to reflect back to folks what we heard from you as we go into this discussion. So before we get going, I'm just gonna invite folks, take a couple minutes to turn to the person next to you. And you've got your instructions up there. Talk about what's your knowledge level of this topic? What are you looking forward to learning about? Or anything else you feel like discussing. So just take a few minutes and I will bring you back and move to the main event, our panel discussion. So I'm going to ask some questions to our amazing comrades. They're going to share their remarks and here we go. So can we move to the next slide, Connor? Thank you. All right, so I actually do want to ask, in addition to this question, why do many queer and trans people identify with and support the struggle for Palestinian liberation? When you answer, if you want to also just start with how you're feeling tonight, how you're doing. Somebody actually asked that in the registration questions. And I thought it was quite nice. And it's also just it's good to know. We're talking about a really intense, big thing, and it's cool to know how you're feeling at the moment. So why do many queer and trans people identify with and support the struggle for Palestinian liberation? Who would like to begin this momentous question?
I don't mind going.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Hold on.
So what is oh, is it not on? Hello? That works. Is this on? Oh no, okay. How's this? If I talk here? Okay, gorgeous. So hello, how am I feeling today? I have to say, I am so I feel so heartened by this moment. I'm here as a queer Palestinian and speaking to a room full of people and saying those things. If you had told me as a young person, as a teenager, that I would be having this moment right now, I would be absolutely blown away and probably scared to hear that I would be doing such a thing. So for me, it's a very full circle moment. I'm really happy and thank you all so much for being here. It's a beautiful thing. Why do so many queer and trans people identify with the struggle for Palestine? I mean, aside from the fact of, basic morality. I think that as queer people, at least coming up in this, in this context, in this culture, queer people know what it is to be discriminated against. One, queer people know what it is to be misunderstood. queer people know what it's like to have misinformation and propaganda about you and your body and your whether or not you are worthy of love and care and bodily autonomy. Queer people have had to reshape their lives. You know, some of us have had to step away from family members, from friends, from communities. We've had to have tough conversations and change the way that we connect with other people. We've had to grieve different relationships that we've had in our lives that didn't support us. And so I think that queer people, just by virtue of a life experience of rejection, I don't know any queer person who has not known what it feels like to be judged and rejected. We are so beautifully equipped to hold space for other people who have been misaligned in that same way. And we feel with that. Because if you don't know what it's like to be judged and, shamed for the right to exist in your body, then it might be harder for you to get to a point where you're like, oh, maybe other people also deserve bodily autonomy. Basic things. And that's it for me on this one, I think, for now.
Oh, the button that says push, not the light. Okay. Thank you so much for this invitation to be here. I'm feeling very moved by the number of people who've come out tonight and very grateful to be part of this conversation. I guess I'll do some of the more like historical conversation component of, I think, some of tonight. One of the things I didn't include in the bio was that I was a member and co-organizer with a group called Queers Against Israeli Apartheid in Toronto from 2009 to 2014. The group started in 2008 and was part of also the transnational Queer Palestine Solidarity movement that kind of was building in the early 2010s and kind of like peaked in 2012 with the World Social Forum, Free Palestine in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where a convergence of queer activists from around the world joined together to build a global campaign for solidarity with Palestine from a queer framework and an anti-pinkwashing project. And maybe to answer the question about like why are queer and trans people so implicated in the Palestine movement, maybe is to say that queer and trans people have been pretty much implicated in most social movements. A lot of the history of the Palestine movement, solidarity movement in Canada, even in the movement itself, owes a lot to the organizing history of queer and trans people who were closeted and organizing within movements without making their sexuality publicly known, maybe known to some of the people within the movements. And that's certainly the case for the Palestine movement in Canada. And so many of the people who became organizers in queer Palestine solidarity organizing here were people who'd long, for many, many, many years, decades even, had been part of Palestine solidarity work already. In fact, there's a nice history in Canada of queer activists who have mobilized in solidarity with international causes. There have been queer organizers who have worked around other social movements in solidarity with Zapatistas and in opposition to South African apartheid. And so in the 1980s, there was an organization called the Simon Nkoli Anti-Apartheid Committee, SNAC, that was connected with activists who were doing queer organizing or, gay and lesbian organizing at the time in Canada, who had been opposing police brutality around the bathhouse raids in the early 80s and the censorship of gay literature and pornography that was the main target of the Canadian government at the time in the 1980s. And the Simon Nkoli Anti-Apartheid Committee, SNAC, built a strong queer political participation in the anti-apartheid movement here, particularly focusing on Simon Nkoli, who was a gay man who had been imprisoned in South Africa, who's a Black South African. And so the history of queer Palestine organizing is actually connected to the history of queer South African anti-apartheid organizing, the connection to the larger history of Palestine solidarity work in Canada. And I think that that kind of like political base of queer activism is something that lends well to people participating in the movement in a kind of a historical sense. And then from the more contemporary context, I think there's so much more knowledge and awareness that people have now than we did even 15 years ago around how states use propaganda. And I think, you know, in this particular moment, people already understood what it meant to appropriate the voices and positions and identities of queer and trans people. And I think a lot of people had enough knowledge to know that this is something that is not okay. And so that I think also lends to it. We have a lot of access now to that material that's really helpful. I know my students teach me about it all the time, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm really glad to know about this. So thanks.
Let's see how this goes. I think it's working pretty well on the first crack. People can hear? Okay, great. Yeah, really honored to be here. Really honored to share the panel space with the three of you. And awesome to see this big full room. I can just echo that I feel a lot of clarity when I'm in spaces like this. And I think we're at a historical moment that is defined by, you know, so much urgency and such apocalyptic stakes on a lot of different fronts, it feels like. But it's also moments like that where I think a lot of illusions can kind of drop away and a lot of truths can kind of become clearer. And I think it's a good moment to kind of redefine our relationship to fear, for sure, you know, because there's a lot of fear that underlies the stories that we tell ourselves about our powerlessness or our hopelessness. And it's also moments like this where we can make new relationships to hope, and to hope, I think, not maybe as a feeling or an emotional state, but hope as a discipline, you know, and hope is something that we choose and that we find in the building and the struggling as individuals and as community. I think that's a really powerful thing. So that's kind of what these kinds of spaces give to me. I'm going to zoom out even further on the question. So it's like a very good order to go in. I think that like for me at the core of this question and my angle on it is talking about queer liberation and what the content of that politics has been in our history. So there's this kind of tension and push and pull through queer and trans history of our communities between different political visions and political horizons and strategies. So I'm going to simplify that a little bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about queer liberation as defined against what I'll call gay liberalism, or you can say queer liberalism, but like a more liberal approach to these sorts of politics. So by that, I really mean, you know, a politics that is kind of single issue, right? So like we are queers or we are gay and lesbian people, and we're fighting for different levels of integration into the dominant power structures. We're kind of banking on that strategy of integrating. Assimilation of various kinds is one way that it's kind of been critiqued. And it can look a variety of ways. You know, there's a long tradition of queer critiques of the institution of marriage, and then gay marriage being critiqued as kind of an assimilationist demand compared to a more radical kind of vision of rethinking what families look like and how they operate. Or it can look like, you know, queer and trans military service. So integration into, you know, even like more overtly kind of troubling entities and structures. So it's a politics that's fighting for those formal rights and for different levels of integration. And it's often been a dominant politics in our community. It's definitely what tends to be on display at Pride. And so unfortunately, it's the global face of our community in a lot of ways as well. And I think we'll get into that a bit when we start talking about pinkwashing and concepts like homo-nationalism. But there's always been this other politics in our history. And Natalie just gave some really, really powerful examples where we have seen and understood ourselves as a group of people oppressed by patriarchal power, state power, and with this objective and natural basis for solidarity and allegiance with other oppressed people. So that's, you know, that idea that no one is free until we all are free, and that queer freedom and liberation can't be achieved under and through systems that oppress others, right? That maintain those hierarchies. And we can't win that freedom by cozying up to those dominant structures. And, you know, that can be anything from the inherent exploitation of capitalist systems, or colonialism and the ongoing plunder of land, or imperialism with the devastation and plunder it's causing on the world planetary scale. So you have this critique that kind of has reasserted itself over and over through our history. And actually, like, the term queer itself partly comes out of one of the moments of that critique, right? Like, compared to gay, like as an umbrella term or whatever else, queer is less definable. Queer has no one single meaning that's just reduced to who you sleep with or your sex act. It's not one set of rights and formal equalities we're fighting for. And it's originally connected to a fairly radical politics that's really challenging that dominant tradition of integration and assimilation. And it also reappropriates violence, right? It takes back a slur, it makes it visible, and it's a sign of resistance in that regard, right? So you have this kind of recurring critique of the queer left or of a queer liberationist horizon throughout the history of our movements. And that's where you get a lot of these concepts that we have been kind of marching under when we organize as Queers for Palestine, for example. So no one is free until everyone is free. Pride is a protest. Pride is political, right? And I think, you know, we're a community where each generation, for most of us, we don't grow up in queer households. We kind of have to rediscover and redefine ourselves and our relationship to those histories. So I think that's a reason why we kind of have this repeating in a generational way, but it is an ongoing kind of contestation of what is our political identity? What do we stand for as queer people, right? And I just say all that because I think this history is a really important context and lens for understanding queer solidarity with Palestine and this moment that we're living right now, obviously with deeper roots, but expanding in a new way now. Palestine as the moral litmus test of the world, as that critical dividing line, because it's one of those issues that for our communities, just like I think for all people of conscience, right? It reveals the dominant structures for what they are. It reveals the strategy of, for us as queers, just to get ours and assimilate into those structures for what it is, right? Because our ruling class, you know, the dominant like political class, the investment in Israel is so deep and the complicity is so deep that there's no space for even slightly integrating the lives and aspirations of Palestinians. And in that sense, to me, Palestine is at the core of our struggle for what our community stands for, right? It's our horizon. It's whether we stand for assimilation and complicity in what is unbearable, or whether we're reclaiming that tradition of solidarity and true liberation for all. So I think that's an inheritance that we kind of have that Natalie, like, again, gave a couple of examples of. And I think that's like us coming home to ourselves in our politics in a way. And we can talk about how that looked with Capital Pride last year in the questions.
Thank you to the three of you for this like kaleidoscope of responses. That's why these panels are so amazing, because we get to hear all these different, you know, just like there's no one type of queer person, no one type of Palestinian person, no one type of any person. We get to hear all these different takes. So from Maria talking about on a personal level, the experiences that queer and trans people go through and how that connects us to this movement, to Natalie talking about the social movement history, and what Natalie was saying really made me think about just that truism that like all movements are held up by women, queer, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming people. We're the ones doing all the work. And so this kind of organizing really allows us to, you know, be like, hey, look, we're always here. And the connection that's always been there between international solidarity from folks here on Turtle Island. And then Maša taking us, you know, full way out into the history of the queer liberation movement, from this assimilationist, liberal, single issue idea to a more radical place. And really saying that, you know, we should choose hope because all of these illusions have fallen away. So let's build something else. And we already are doing it even in this room right now. So with that in mind, let's move to the next question. So I don't know if it's up there already. Why is connecting the queer, trans, and Palestinian struggles a powerful strategy for building an even stronger liberation movement? Do, do, do.
Do that back again.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is connecting? Oh, yeah. I heard it too. I don't know, but for some reason I have to read it again. Why is connecting the queer, trans, and Palestinian struggle a powerful strategy for building an even stronger liberation movement? There is so much I can say about this. Something that my Palestinian father has recently said to me is he said, these times have not just exposed Israel for what it is in the world, but it has also taken people back to 1948 in a way that we have actually been like cut on this like historical timeline that we all believe, this colonial timeline. And let's actually go back and examine the history of how we got here. And especially in Canada, Canadian culture really lives in this like silo where it like, inside the Canadian mythology where, Indigenous people, like they're gone, we just acknowledge that we're here now, without looking at, these colonial legacies that exist to this day. And the first time that, physical intimacy between two people of the same gender was, banned in Palestine was because of the British Mandate. The British did that, not us. Now, pinkwashing is such a big part of the propaganda because it is one of the cornerstones of Zionist propaganda saying Israel is this like haven for, for queers and multicultural people, and the Arabs, the Palestinians, these are backwards people that don't understand inclusion, they don't understand morality. And that framing of Palestinians as inherently queerphobic, inherently homophobic, inherently transphobic is part of the broader picture of, what Edward Said coined as Orientalism, the specific form of racism that people from, Swana, South, oh boy, I'm going to mess that up. But, the language is hard, huh?
Southwest Asia and North Africa.
Thank you. It's a big part of how all the folks that, live in regions that are not considered like Western, English speaking, European are demonized as being, backwards people. And that is like the foundation of colonialism. And so part of what makes it so important to connect, among many other reasons, to connect queer liberation with the liberation for Palestine is not only is it unhooking this idea that people have as Palestinians as inherently bigoted or something, it's also about what stories has the world been telling about whiteness and about, the global South, and unhooking this idea that Western countries and, Israel, sure, but, that all of them are more progressive than these other cultures in these other regions that have not actually been able to, develop in these progressive ways that the West wants to impose as being very important because they're too busy getting bombed among many other, horrific, oppressive things that the West does in the global South. And so for me, a big piece of it is about shattering this idea that the West has about being able to lecture other cultures and other places about progressive values. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that. I think what you've really described is very clearly how like the structure of pinkwashing works. And one of the things I was wondering is, do people need a definition of pinkwashing and homo nationalism? Yes, there's some nods. Okay, so I'll play a teacher, and sorry I didn't bring my slides, but just to get a basic definition down. Pinkwashing is the use of sexual rights and sexuality to basically cover the tracks of some kind of violation of some other type of human rights violation. So it doesn't have to be like apartheid or genocide that is pinkwashing, like the covering up of the violation of Palestinian human rights. It can also be breast cancer awareness. It could be the tar sands. And so those are things that in one of the extra reading resources, there's an article from a long, long time ago that Claire and I are both interviewed in that goes into some of that history. But that is a term that was introduced by a gender studies scholar named Jasbir Puar, who's based in the United States, well, now Canada. And she wrote a book in 2007, I think, called Terrorist Assemblages. And there were already people who were talking about like the normalization of like homosexuality and this idea of homonormativity had already been circulating, and people had already been critiquing the kind of project of Western imperialism and the use of gender rights and sexuality in relation to that. So for those of you who were around at the time, maybe not everybody, when the war on terror started, the justification for the war in Iraq was to save women from Islam and, from the Taliban. So this is like part of the rhetoric that was used to justify. So the move from that to using sexual rights and gay people to justify why we might want to support military campaigns that are antithetical to the general rights and interests of people in overall, kind of comes from an era when gender and sexuality in the early 2000s were really being mobilized by politics. And Jasbir Puar said that this idea of homonationalism, the idea of the state suddenly welcoming a particular kind of national homosexual subject into its fold, like a gay soldier or, an idea of gay marriage in particular, was being developed in opposition to an elsewhere that was homophobic in the way that Maria described. And that this tenuous kind of relationship between inclusion of certain kinds of digestible and palatable sexual subjects into the state was in the interest of mobilizing foreign policy primarily. So this like newfound acceptance of gay people was, first of all, not a universal acceptance. And second of all, it was a kind of weaponization of sexuality as a way to justify foreign policy, primarily in the Middle East. And so those are like two foundational concepts and ideas that are at the core of a lot of the queer Palestine solidarity, like, critique of the way that people will, maybe I'll also go back a little bit in some of the history that in 2005, the Palestinian academic and cultural boycott of Israel was launched, which is the first large-scale international civil society movement coming from Palestine, calling for international academic and cultural boycott of Israel to pressure it to follow and respect international human rights and allow for the right of return of Palestinians and free and equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So PACB's mandate led to a kind of reaction by the Israeli state in an international public relations campaign called Brand Israel that was launched in 2005. And Brand Israel was a global propaganda project funded by the state. And the goal was to fill international public discourse in arts, culture, science, technology, education, and tourism with positive representations of Israel. And that this was a key part of the global kind of like war for Israel in the international arena, was to change the messaging and image. And so this led to a huge amount of money being put into funding special arts and cultural events, spotlights on Israeli artists, sending Israeli artists and cultural producers as ambassadors, and also marketing tourism to Israel. And Brand Israel was piloted in Toronto in 2005. And one of its targets was the gay and lesbian community. So there was a tourism campaign. Suddenly all over Toronto, there were ads inviting people to travel to Israel for gay tourism, to participate in, go to the beaches of Tel Aviv, participate in Tel Aviv's nightlife. Meanwhile, the status of queer people who were Israeli citizens was not great. There was, it continues to be extensive homophobia within Israel, and including at the time a series of events that were direct targets and attacks on queer and trans people. And so Brand Israel was happening. There was the 2006 World Pride, which is like a kind of corporate global tourism World Pride like structure that has no actual relationship to local pride parades, was going to be held in Jerusalem, and that got canceled. And so all of that kind of history is a pretty important part of why queer people started to publicly organize as queers in response to the continued condition of apartheid and violation of Palestinian human rights, because they were being targeted by Israeli Hasbara projects, so propaganda projects, through Brand Israel's project. And so there were a few things that were happening at the time, including, a bunch of lobby organizations in Canada that were producing propaganda material. There was like an ad campaign called Size Doesn't Matter that was funded by the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. And Stand With Us, which is another lobby organization in North America, did a bunch of targeted ads in publications that, equated support for Palestinians with support for terrorism or executions of gays and lesbians in the Middle East.
Yeah, I love. I kind of had hoped and thought that I would not have to come in here with those like specific historical details for the last few decades. So I'm very glad I didn't prep for that. I love this question. I'm just kind of going to bring it right back to that. It has two of my favorite words in it. It has power and it has strategy. And I always love saying, like, I love talking about power. Power is my favorite subject. All my union comrades know, because it makes me sound like a supervillain. It's great. Some gay coded supervillain in a Marvel movie. So I think there's a lot of different answers to this question. And a huge part for me when we're talking about different movements and how we build power together is to talk about what it is that those struggles have in common at a moment in history. So like there's different ways to do that. One is like sometimes there's specifically like a community or an identity or something that we have a stake in is being weaponized to cover up or justify something else, the violence of pinkwashing. And I'll have some more to say about that with the third question. But it's also those basic questions of, what are the common threats? What are the common enemies? And then talking about power, the power that we need and the power that we lack, and building the power to be able to fight and to defend ourselves. So all of that is going to, ooh, that just got louder. All of that is kind of going to be moving from queer political vision, which I kind of already spoke about, and we all have really touched on, to queer political strategies. And I should say, I organize more in Palestine solidarity space than I do in queer and trans space these days. And in the Palestine solidarity movement, and I know a lot of people in this room have been so critically involved in the last year and a half, we don't in this country have the power at this moment to do what we need to do. After a year and a half of genocide, we've done a lot, but we are nowhere near doing what the requests for us out of Palestine have been. We're nowhere near stopping the arms trade. We're nowhere near ending our ruling class and politicians' complicity in apartheid and genocide, right? We don't have the power to force those decisions and to make it so, to go from where we are to where we want to be. We're right, and we're in the right, but that's not enough. And that's the question of power, right? And I think it's really, really cross-cutting and topical, because if we look at the situation for us right now as queer and trans people, right, it's pretty plain that we're in a moment of intense global threats and backlash and an ascendant kind of global far right. And we're seeing actual rights being sort of rolled back and targeted legislation, particularly at, trans people, trans youth, trans women, impacting gender affirming healthcare, our ability to move through public space. And I do think it kind of sheds light on, let's say, the fragility of where we are right now at this moment in history and how our history has gone. We tend to think or we assume on some level that history is a steady arc of progress, right? Ever upward, especially in countries like this, it's easy to believe that narrative as queers have successively organized for and won, different layers of formal rights and legislation and outmaneuvering those waves of right-wing backlash. But that's really changing in this moment of global crisis. It's changing basically everywhere. It's definitely changing here. And I think trans people in particular are bearing the brunt of that and know that best. And so it brings those questions of what are the interests that are attacking us and why right up to the fore, and also the question of how much power do we have to fight back? And that kind of takes us to that question of strategy, right? Because it's the basic strategic questions, again, of like a more liberal kind of framework or queer liberation. So, not even looking at that long-term political vision, just what is your plan to win and to hold on to what you've won? And I kind of put it to the room, do we expect that the dominant structures of our society will protect us and the things that we've gained out of goodness, benevolence, or just because we're right, do we expect that structures like the police and the military and the banks and the mega corporations and the tech giants and the government departments and politicians will protect us? And if the answer is no, do we have the power to protect ourselves? And realistically, we are a small community. We're geographically dispersed, kind of definitionally. So we need allies, and we need good allies that we can count on, not, Galen Weston or Justin Trudeau. We need to be part of coalitions that are building people power, and meaning that power that comes with having very large numbers of people who are organized and ready and willing to take collective action to defend their interests, right? So that's kind of, from the moment of Stonewall onward, that was part of the strategy of a lot of organizations that came up after 1969. There was a wave of organizations called the Gay Liberation Front across the US that did tons of organizing to basically make the first Pride a commemoration of a riot. There were lots of people in the queer community who thought that was an appalling idea. Like, why would we want to write a riot led by, working class, trans youth, street queens, queers of color, at a mafia-run dive bar in Greenwich Village? Why would we make that the founding concept of our community? There was already at that time in some cities a bit of a liberal gay establishment that really was very opposed to that. So as an organizing achievement, that Stonewall became that founding story. So I think that's really important. But just to go back, like the concept at that moment was, we as queers need to take our place in the streets. It's not just we're visible because, we're coming out of the closets. It's a moment where we have to take our place in the movement. And that looks a bit different now than it did at that moment. But like, we win through solidarity and people power and coalition building. And I think we can get more into that question as we go on, but it's very central to the question of building relationship and coalition between different movements that are made up of people who are facing, here domestically, let's say, different forms of scapegoating, right? And, within Canada, obviously last year and a half has been a horror show of anti-Palestinian racism, which of course is already like deeply embedded and really tied to decades-long kind of scapegoating and right-wing campaigns of anti-Arab and Islamophobic racism as well. So I think it's really important strategically for us to be clear on, because all scapegoating at the end of the day is right-wing populism, right? And it always functions by distracting majorities of people from the real material issues that are impacting their lives. And at this moment, we can say unprecedented wealth concentration by the ultra-rich, naked profiteering by corporations and landlords, climate and ecological devastation, just, the decimation of social security nets that used to make working people's lives kind of bearable. And all of those things disproportionately impacting both queers and also immigrants, including many Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian people in this country. So there's a lot of natural common ground and common targets and power to build on these shared issues and to do it against those kind of common enemies that are scapegoating us. And we need power. We need power to defend our communities. under attack, and also to be able to force our government to cease complicity with states that are committing unimaginable crimes against humanity, as Israel is.
I could just sit and listen to y'all talking all night. It is beautiful. Yeah, thank you for like bringing all these different perspectives again to this question. So Maša really bringing in the class and power analysis, which I think we can all really benefit from when we're looking at the world today. It's so stark and clear. We talked about it being a moment of clarity, right? And really like in terms of finding common ground, whose side, who's on our side and who isn't, who's on the side of Palestine, who's on the side of trans people, who's on the side of queer people, right? And finding these common areas. Natalie gave us a really great summary of what is pinkwashing, how is it used. Also gave me a flashback to when I was a student at U of T in the early 2000s, and there was a lot of Hilleling and brand Israelism going on there. I remember being handed a condom in a package that had brand Israel branding on it, and it said size matters, and it was a little map of what we would call Palestine, what they call Israel. Anyway, I still have it actually because it's so ridiculous. But anyway, thank you for the flashback. But also having these terms, right? Pinkwashing and homo nationalism, what are they, and how do they explain all of this to us? How do they help us make sense of this? But also, how do we talk about them in an accessible way? Because maybe sometimes these words can seem big. And then Maria really bringing us into the all this Orientalist construction of what it is to be Arab, what it is to be Palestinian, and what it is to be queer and trans, and how coming together in these struggles, there's a power in that it deconstructs these myths and deconstructs whiteness in this way, where there's this idea of queerness and transness being a Western thing and not a part of any other culture, and vice versa. So thank you for bringing all of these threads together. We're going to move to our third question, which actually half of it we've already covered. If we can go to the next one. Yeah, thank you, Connor. What are some other challenges that exist in connecting these struggles? So we've talked about pinkwashing. We can talk about it more for sure. We've talked about the reality of rising fascism, concentration of wealth, all of these things. So in terms of either big picture or small picture, right, in doing this work, what are some challenges that you have dealt with? And I mean, feel free to also add successes.
It's still on. Oh, nice. Okay. This is the question that I probably have the most to say about. So I trust that you'll stop me if I go on for too long. So when I was reflecting on what do I want to talk about, you know, what do I want to bring to this table today specifically, one thing that's very important for me in terms of just the advocacy that I have done as a queer Palestinian in the last year and a half is all of it is kind of rooted in just me being myself and telling my story. And so I want to root what I'm about to say in you know, a very short Netflix synopsis version of my life as a queer Palestinian. So I've grown up in Ottawa all my life, and my family are Christian Palestinians. And I make that distinction not out of any sense of like devotion to like being religious, but because Christianity, first of all, Christianity started in the Middle East, in Palestine specifically. But second, because Christian Palestinians are, you know, on a numbers level, a minority within Palestine. And I grew up very religious in an Arabic speaking church environment. And because, you know, not different from many other church environments, it was inherently queerphobic and homophobic and transphobic. And at the same time, this religious community was also where my Arab friends were and where I spoke Arabic and hung out with people who shared my culture and, you know, could, you know, laugh about having immigrant parents together. So there was an inherent tension for me all my life that if I accept my queerness and I come out, then I have to leave this cultural space where I can, you know, speak my language and be among people who eat the same foods that, you know, their mom and their teta cooks. And so this tension, you know, I see a lot of people nodding in the room. I think a lot of people relate to this, of queer people often have to pick between aspects of their identity to feel safe. And when I left, you know, the church. I started going to queer Christian conferences, if you can like believe these things do exist. And they really changed my life because I started meeting all these like sparkly Jesus people. Like it was like astounding to me. And I would go to these conferences in the States mostly, and they really changed my world and helped me become more comfortable, unlearn a lot of the shaming that I'd learned growing up in church, and be proud and come out and say, yeah, all of these things are true about me. And I met some wonderful people. Now, flash forward to these past times, I've gone and I've looked up some of the folks that I connected with at the queer Christian conferences during the genocide to see what have they said. And a majority of them have not said anything. And I want to give, some people have, but why I'm saying this is that, spaces where queer people can belong, all of us who are queer know that, as Maša said, like we don't grow up into queer families, most of us, but we might grow up into a family that shares our culture. And so it's incredibly important for there to be spaces where queer Palestinians can be seen in all aspects of their identity. And this is not just about like, let's be nice and inclusive to queer Palestinians because they deserve it. This is because representation, especially within, queer media, representation is huge. It's huge, right? Should I move this? Is this better? No. So, to begin with in TV and in movies, first of all, rarely do you see an Arab in general. You're, very extremely rarely are you going to see someone who is Palestinian and not, framed as a terrorist. And then it's going to be extremely, unlikely that you're ever going to come across a queer Palestinian Christian, so intersectionality is huge. And I never thought that I would be like this, like spokesperson for queer Palestinians. I was just like living my life. But when the genocide, quote unquote, started, as we know, it started many, many years ago, but this escalation of Israel's genocide against the people of Gaza and Palestine, I knew, okay, I need to own all of this because, the Zionist propaganda is invested in someone like me being invisible. 1. 2, because of queers in Palestine are oppressed for their queerness from 2 different angles. One being the difficulties that some of our communities, have with queer identity. And that gets weaponized against us as Palestinians and weaponized against us as Arabs. But I mean, to folks who belong to other, non-white cultures, this is true in many cultures. Many cultures around the world struggle and are still not, they're not keeping up supposedly with Western countries and their, queer acceptance. But we don't weaponize that against other cultures the same way that it is weaponized back against Palestinians. Of, okay, this community here, these Palestinian people, they don't accept queer. Can Palestinian culture have the right to grow and change and progress in that way on our own timeline? So in Palestine, I can't speak to every experience ever, but on the one hand, we have, people who just like here, just like me as, a Palestinian here in, Canada, struggle to come out to my parents and struggle to be queer and public with my community. That's obviously also going to be a struggle for queers in Palestine. But secondly, something, for example, that happens in the West Bank, which is, a form of the pinkwashing that they do, is the Israeli intelligence Mossad in the West Bank. Whenever they find out that somebody, a Palestinian, is queer, they start to blackmail that person into being an informant for them. And they'll blackmail them by saying, well, we know that you hooked up with so-and-so. We have your records from, Grind or whatever, but I don't know what apps they're using in Palestine, honestly. But so queers in Palestine are not, they do not feel safe to be public. And that is not the fault of Palestinian culture. Queerphobia is something we all have to battle in every culture and every space, but also because of the unique way that Israel oppresses them. And so we are at this point, right, where we want to say, yes, queer Palestinians exist, but it is going to be very difficult for the queer Palestinians who are still on the ground in Palestine to be that visibility and to be that representation because they are not safe. And so who's going to go out and represent and say, yes, queer Palestinians exist and actually like we're lovely and we're a good time and we're here kicking with you? Like, who's going to do that? And if we as Palestinians in diaspora who are queer and Arabs who are queer are not visible, then nobody does that. Nobody becomes that representation. And so what is the challenge to connecting this is that queer Palestinians, queer Arabs, they need places to be safe. They need to know, especially to the people who are of an Arab background in this room, they need to know that you're a safe person. Because I'm sure that, those of us who are queer, we know what it's like to meet someone and be like, well, unless you tell me otherwise, I'm going to assume that you are discriminating against me as a queer person. If I don't see, the rainbow flag, which can also mean nothing as we are literally talking about now. If I don't see a signal, right? Or I don't know what it's like to be trans. I am a cis woman, but I imagine when somebody's using the rainbow flag that isn't the intersectional one, that doesn't have the trans, signaling safety is so incredibly important. And so for folks who want to help, please help us to make queer Palestinians, especially the youth and the young, help them to know that they're safe and they're welcomed and that it's okay to be who they are and they're going to be supported in every aspect of their identity. Thank you.
Thank you so much again, Maria, for your insights and experiences. I think it's really nice to have a conversation across these different perspectives for that reason, like to really see what echoes across the different kinds of positionalities of the people at the table. And I'll just say a couple things about what I think are some of the challenges that we're facing right now. I already explained and talked a bit about pinkwashing, and I think our movement right now is faced with a kind of bit of a contradictory standpoint and set of obligations for the struggle that we're in right now. And one of those is resisting pinkwashing and interrupting the weaponization of the ways in which homophobia is mobilized as a way to defend and justify Israel's genocide and violation of international rights, but also the weaponization of sexual violence. I think this is a connected issue and struggle in relation to this that we really need to be fighting and pushing back against. And while we're doing that kind of work, as well as building and working and contributing towards the larger Palestine movement, I think we also are facing another kind of struggle that is a quiet struggle that is not public facing, but much more internal and is about capacity building, long-term coalition building, and the potential for solidarity. And that is facing the right-wing move that has shifted the kind of larger political landscape in North America over the last few years. And I think many of you are aware of the parental rights movement in Canada, which is, an anti-trans and anti-queer movement. It's a movement that has gained a lot of support within our communities of people working in the Palestine Solidarity movement. And it has meant that many of us who are part of the movement have faced targeted homophobia and transphobia from our comrades in the movement more broadly. And this is a real challenge within the movement more generally, but it's a challenge for what Maša described earlier, which is the effect of right-wing populism and the use of scapegoating to divide populations who are oppressed by similar structures and institutions and systems. And so we have, unfortunately, in our horizon, a significant amount of work that we will be left having to do. And I think I'm saying this because it's an unfortunate reality that we're the ones who will have to build this work, which is to bridge this divide that has been created by right-wing populist rhetoric using primarily misinformation to turn our communities against us. And in particular, the use of weaponization of fears of immigrant and religious minority communities in the country around what happens in education, and in particular, the way that sex education and gender inclusive education has become a central target in our communities. And I'm saying that this is our responsibility because it's not going to come from other people in the country. People are not invested in resisting the right-wing shift that's happened in this area, and being at the demonstrations that when this happened before the start of the genocide, and seeing the division of primarily racialized communities on one side and queer and trans communities on the other side was an incredibly heartbreaking and devastating experience for many people, especially people who are Arab, Muslim, South Asian, queer and trans people who saw members of their communities on the other side. And then only to find weeks later marching alongside one another in our Palestine movements, and then finding at the following year, people leaving encampments to go to the parental rights demonstration. And these, I think, are part of something that we will have to contend with in the years to come, that there has been a division that's been created, and we will have to take on the work of rebuilding a bridge with communities that maybe hadn't actively been supporting queer and trans people, but who are not actively hostile in such a public way. And I'm saying that this is a form of weaponization because it is an intentional practice that's been done. It's not something that is coming spontaneously from the grassroots. It's not coming from people's communities. It has come from a well-funded and right-wing propaganda machine coming out of the United States, and has funded this movement in Canada. And I think that this is maybe one of the biggest challenges that we're going to be facing in the years ahead. So I'm saying this because I know it's a hard thing to contend with. I know many of us grapple with this already in our families, especially if we come from families with histories in the region. But it's definitely work that many of us are quietly trying to do, and that I think that we're going to have to continue to work towards, and maybe bring this to a much more public place. So I share this to share like a hope that we can actually build these bridges, that we can actually do the work of building coalition with people who might in other contexts be our opponents. I actually really believe in the power of coalition, especially given the kind of world ahead of us. And now I think is the time more than ever for us to build our capacity to work with people who we might otherwise be fearful of. And in fact, this is the foundation of what feminist coalition building is. I really think often about the words of Bernice Johnson Reagon, who in a speech at a women's movement said to the participants and the people in the audience that, if you feel safe, you're not doing coalition work. You're in community, but you're not doing coalition. And you have to be with people who in another context might be willing to kill you if you're going to really do coalition right. And it's a really extreme thing to say, but it's true. Like that is what it means to build coalition. And I think that, given what people have been sharing at the table today, I think that this is actually something that we need to build resilience around within our queer and trans communities to be able to survive the future of what's ahead. So it's something that I really am dedicated to working towards, and I feel actually hopeful about our capacity to do it because we've done it with each other for so long.
I'm really moved by what you've both said. I think this is really like it's a very important and courageous conversation. And I want to maybe talk on, like, I had some stuff about pinkwashing in general that I want to kind of put it to the side because I want to speak a little bit about, a lot of us who are allies in this room, like certainly in this particular context, but, with different relationships to complex kind of family or community dynamics. I want to say just first of all on pinkwashing, like, I think it is really important for us to understand it in a plain language way. Like it's an academic concept in some ways, but it is basically like very, very fundamental and very violent because it is the weaponization of our community, our identities, our lives, our loves, our being in the service of extremely violent and destructive projects. In a way that for a lot of us actually tears us right down the middle. I think it's extremely dark, actually. As queers, as trans people in general, many of us have very progressive values, as Maria was saying, like based on our firsthand experiences of discrimination and oppression and having to kind of find ourselves and navigate those realities. But it is, I think, objectively the case that that is not the institutional and global face of our community in a lot of ways, because rainbows are constantly splashed on all sorts of things that are absolutely disgusting to us. And we are not yet in a place systematically to be able to stop that, to be able to draw a clear line of demarcation and say, that has nothing to do with us. And I think that's like a problem of organization. And it is also a problem of, if we want to think of it in that way, of allyship, right? Like, and of whiteness within our movements. Like, I think that is an important framework to some extent to bring into it. But I just want to, like, on the specific, like, again, from that position of an ally that people share, like, I think it's very important for our movements to be making those strategic alliances with organizers and leaders within, for example, faith communities and diaspora communities who have influence and who are also in various ways shifting those conversations from where they currently are in those contexts to a place that makes coalition more possible. And that's going to require, for a lot of us, I think, accepting that it might not meet us exactly where we're at as a community. We're a community that has a certain sense of like our principles and our purity, and sometimes we're a little bit of a subculture or a counterculture, and we need to get a lot better at talking to people who don't agree with us on everything. We need to get a lot better at finding that common ground. And I think, we have those shared existential threats, those shared experiences of oppression, marginalization, scapegoating. Those are real bases for unity. There's more in common than there is things that kind of differ. And I really am always inspired. And I think like the leadership in this work is going to be carried out by queer of color organizers. And I think you really see this, and Natalie, you kind of referenced this a little bit with kind of the deeper history of feminist organizing. Like, you also see this in, I think, Black queer and Black women's organizing traditions and Indigenous organizing traditions as well, that refusal to sort of cut out or give up on our families and communities who themselves are subjected to colonial violence, to white supremacist violence. And I think this is very difficult and painful, certainly for those whose backs become the bridge, to, like, it's a quote from a radical woman of color anthology from the 80s that I really like, and that I think of often. But the rest of us, I think, have an extra obligation to unlearn and address and find ways to manage that tendency toward purism and rigidity, and expecting that people be on the same political line as us as a condition of being around them or working with them or being in coalition with them. And that's hard. And we all need to sort of gauge when we can and can't do that. We've all faced violence of many forms. And it requires us, I think, to learn more ways to take care of our own hurt and our own trauma and each other's trauma as well. But I do think we owe that to our comrades. And that, to me, is a sort of organizing practice of queer love and queer community and of allyship as well.
Again, whoa, thank you. Yeah, all your different interventions made me think of different things, and like throughout the time I've done this kind of work. Maria talking about Palestinian, queer Palestinians, and particularly, in your case, Christian queer Palestinians, and how you need to just be able to exist in your own everything of all you are, and the multiple levels of homophobia that you experience, and Palestinians as well. It made me remember when I was learning, when I was newer to this movement, I think I was at a talk by some Lebanese queer activists, and it was around the time of the war on Lebanon in 2006 by Israel, bombing Lebanon. And they said, we opened our queer community center to folks who are trying to get safety from the bombing, right? And they really clarified for me in my mind, who didn't know at the time, like, yeah, how are these folks supposed to be running their queer community center and just fighting for their queer rights when they're literally helping their community and surviving bombing by an occupier or a would-be occupier, right? So that really brought me back to that. And I think it helps us see, especially those of us without that experience. Natalie really bringing in the clarifying, like, what are the real challenges, especially in this ascendant far right moment in the world. And I really appreciated how you expressed like your intentional belief in building capacity to actually face these things, because we do have power, but it's hard. And coming to what Maša said, right? Like, this is hard and messy work, and unlearning these purist and rigid ideas we have of what it means to be in solidarity with Palestine or with our beliefs for a better world. We need to, question that and talk to people. And, I hate how much people say be uncomfortable, but actually it can feel really, really weird and uncomfortable and yucky. But yeah, we got to do it. We got to get messy. So thank you all for these contributions. Let's give them a little round of applause. We will be hearing more from these folks. We started about 20 minutes late. So what we're going to do is we're going to move to our little discussion period now, but we're going to shorten it up just to about 5 minutes. And, if you keep talking and talking, I'll let you talk a bit more. But I know we want to get to the Q&A. So just chat with those around you. You can choose one question or more. What stuck with you most from the discussion? Or what are some challenges you have faced or successes in doing this work? So take a few minutes to chat about that. I know there's a lot to say, and it's actually great to see everybody like talking during these little moments when we give you a chance to, because sometimes I'm worried that people are not going to be into it. So Q&A time. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Yipeng is going to come with the microphone to give you a chance to talk. We will prioritize, according to, question time priorities. So we got some hands up. So go ahead, sir. Why don't we start over here?
Okay, I have a question. I kind of started with Natalie's intervention around pinkwashing. So what is the significance of concepts like pinkwashing, homo nationalism, human rights in the time of global fascism, where that appeal is no longer there? There's no real appeal to being progressive, multicultural. I think this is the fall of liberalism and international institutions, long time coming, if you've been paying attention. So I'm wondering if the fight around pinkwashing or human rights is no longer the paradigm that we're in, and maybe the moment that we're in is a lot more raw and blunt, and this is about power and war. So maybe this is less the time of a subtle response, more like a gentle response is not where we're at. Maybe this is the time for like strategic discipline, a more proportional response to what's happening, and a more direct confrontation. And again, going back to what Maša said about discipline, because this is actually the time of apocalypse. And I'm not using that as an exaggeration. I'm saying to you that like my standpoint in terms of work and the things that I see, where billions of your tax dollars go, someone like me sees it every day. And we just funded pipelines that are literally going to destroy the air and the earth on which you have to organize. So this is it. It hasn't hit you in Ottawa, maybe. It hasn't hit you in Toronto, maybe. It's here. And if you are like more global, international, not from here, you already know that. So I'm just wondering, are we supposed to be talking about pinkwashing at this point?
Would you like us to take like a group of 3, or you want to? Yeah, 3. Okay, so a couple more. Raise your hands. All right, let's go to the front row here.
Hello. Hi. I think you're going to protests, I've seen a lot of the history of AIDS activism in different strategies that people use through direct actions or die-ins and things like that. And I'm really interested to know if you know anything about the history of AIDS activism in the context of Palestine, if there is a history there.
And one more, why don't we go up to the back there? You can give you some exercise.
This sort of, I guess, good mention on the AIDS activism piece, because I do want to talk about that a little bit. I guess I'm thinking about the point on building strong, long-lasting movements, and sort of the idea of class and power, but also thinking about, you know, given the history of AIDS and like mass disablement against queer people by the government and class oppression and exclusion from the working class, I guess I wonder how we talk about building long-lasting movements in a modern context, living in a pandemic, where we've got built-in attrition from our movements because we don't have, you know what, I'm grateful that this event is masked, but many direct actions are not. And we talk about it from the standpoint of personal safety. But I guess I just wonder how we reconcile that conversation about building those movements without the centering of disability justice, knowing that genocide and mass disablement is a tool of the state, often to oppress us.
I can get us started, I guess. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think we're not in a moment where pinkwashing is like the biggest struggle in the front of Palestine organizing, and it's definitely not the biggest front in the challenges of the world that we're living in right now. But I think the thing that's helpful about the historical work on pinkwashing is that it helps us understand the history of how states have used particular kinds of appeals to rights in ways that were disingenuous to the claims that they made, and how people within our communities have been complicit within that. And it helps us, I think, also equip ourselves with maybe a resilience to the sophisticated way that propaganda is used today to justify the kinds of decisions that are being made by people in positions of power that will accelerate the death of most people on the planet, as what you described, I think, is really apt. And that's one of the reasons why I think I'm really in agreement with Maša that, you know, we need to be doing a lot of really critical capacity building work to work across struggles right now and build coalition, because it's true that we don't have a critical mass to be able to do the kind of mass political work to change the structures of power that we have right now. But I think to get there requires a lot of like small building work, unfortunately. And that's where I think that if we think about queer organizing and the kinds of spaces like these ones create, I think an important way to do that and build that is to start trying to find the people that are hardest to organize with and work with, and try and build some of those capacities for coalition in some form. And so, you know, like, I really think that we all do need to be participating in, sorry, I'm like really, I don't know why it's so, it's got so much pop in it, but yeah, I think we do need to be really participating in a broader base of social movement work. We need to be pushing our movements across the board to be responding much more holistically to the reality of what's happening. And I think we have to stop sugarcoating the reality of the situation that we're in. Absolutely. Like, we can't pretend like we're going to bring about like a specific liberation right now in our lifetime unless we think really about how to completely transform the global structures of economic and power systems that shape every decision that's made that impacts all life on the planet. And so, yeah, I think what you said is very apt and very important right now. And I'm happy that you said it. So thank you. And in relation to the other questions, I actually don't know. I don't know about HIV AIDS organizing in the Palestine movement, other than the people in here in North America that I know who've done work in both of those areas. But I'm really curious to know if that exists and what form that takes. I think a lot of it might be international NGO work more than social movement work, but that's a suspicion rather than a form of knowledge. And I think your question is a really important call for us to take action. So thank you for that. I don't know. I shouldn't be the only one answering. Oh, you have a.
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Okay. Great. I can just add like a couple of thoughts. And I do think, yeah, all three questions were super apt, and like I think on the first and like of the stakes of the moment that we're in, and like certainly like looking at the US concretely and specifically, like we're seeing a kind of epochal reorientation of how US power is projected worldwide, and like a really a discarding of a lot of the forms of soft power that have previously been used to justify it, which is often, you know, kind of dressing it up in the civilizational liberal project of like the US is a force for good worldwide that's liberating women and the queers from backwards countries. Like that kind of narrative that has been used to sugarcoat and kind of sell and win consensus from domestic populations and on international stages for those kind of imperialist and military projects. Like that context has shifted now, I think, absolutely. But I don't think that liberalism is dead. I definitely don't think that's the case. I think in Canada, we've just seen a little bit of, in this election, like a re-entrenchment of basically a prime minister who is once again kind of reiterating the status quo on many different issues and in many different regards. So like, and I think that there is, like we saw in this most recent election campaign, kind of an application of some of the like digital and media and propaganda strategies that have been used really effectively by the far right worldwide, but using them toward liberal ends. So all that is to say that, like, I think as much as we have these kind of critical far right threats, I think we also always have to be on guard against the fact that a liberal alternative is still lurking out there. You know, this is, even if we look at Israel itself, like, of course, there's Netanyahu and Likud and this really like grotesque religious fascist kind of power structure. But there is also a liberal Zionist kind of quote unquote opposition that is actually very comfortable with the continued status quo of occupation and apartheid and different forms of genocide, just kind of dressed up a little bit differently and justified in kind of different terms, like drawing on the long history of what was called labor Zionism, which used kind of different language to justify the same thing. So I think we still need to have that kind of critique, and we still need to know it, and we still need to be like on guard against it, because as our movements build power, right now we do not have much power, but as we build power, there are those very real threats of co-optation of movements and defanging of movements. And we saw that especially in the course of like the 60s and 70s and in a lot of contexts, and certainly in the US and Canada. And then the other thing I would say is that, like, a lot of the utility of like talking about pinkwashing is also for us when we're making interventions in our community, right? Because like in our community specifically, there are far too many people who are comfortable to a varying extent, or at least think that they're comfortable with our community and our flags and our colors kind of being attached to certain things, you know, and we don't have to go quite as grotesque as like, you know, Israeli soldiers, like IOF forces flashing rainbow flags on the ruins of Gaza. We can also talk about, you know, major like banks with like intense complicity in colonialism domestically and abroad, splashing pride flags on their window panes and like being greeted in our pride marches. Like that's a problem, right? Like we need to draw a line there, and we need to take those spaces and not cede any terrain of struggle. And I think prides in particular, as kind of that showcase of what is our community and what does it stand for, are one of those really important kind of terrains of struggle. So those are just like a couple of thoughts, but I think we need to ultimately, like, we all have different roles. There's a million urgent needs at once, and we need to politicize everything and intervene in all spaces as like reflects where we are and where we have reach. To the other questions, I'm also not, or to the question certainly of like AIDS activism and that history, I'm also not like super expert on this, but I agree with what Natalie said that, as well, that like there's a lot of crossover historically in terms of like especially militant AIDS activism and organizations like ACT UP and kind of leading organizers in those spaces, and Palestine solidarity and other kind of international solidarity projects, whether it's South African anti-apartheid or against intervention in Central America. There was a lot of organizing like that, especially in the Bay Area, kind of further back into the 80s. And I don't think that's accidental, because it's again kind of that through line of a queer left tradition where, you know, at a moment when kind of like the AIDS crisis was very, I think, radicalizing, because it was a moment when kind of an assimilationist strategy for our communities was more obviously showing up its contradictions, because those dominant power structures were so fully kind of turning their backs on our communities at a moment of crisis. And also just to again, thank you for that comment. And I think it's really important, and integrating disability justice really rigorously into our organizing practice is very crucial. And I think there is certainly a responsibility for us as individuals and when we organize spaces to do that. And I think there's also a huge need for us to build power together toward like really sustainable structural solutions as well. So, you know, we've had a complete abdication of public health from our governments and kind of governments worldwide. And that is cross-cutting, like it certainly applies to COVID, but it's cross-cutting across many other situations, other crises, and other lacks of accessibility of our spaces. So I think we need to really reckon with that in a very serious way. Thanks.
Thank you for these questions. I'm gonna go this way. Thank you for the critique about disability justice. I know that that's an area where I often find myself needing to check myself, because if we're not going to talk about disability, then we're actually kidding ourselves if we think we're fighting for Palestinians. Because, you know, if we're going to talk about a free Palestine anytime soon, we're going to talk about, you know, a vast number that I cannot even imagine who now, you know, have been maimed and blinded. And at the same time, I want to say that disability justice shouldn't just be important because these people were victims of this crime. And, you know, we have to be real about human bodies and their diversity, and not be working from a framework of like the able-bodied person as this standard person, in the same way that a straight person or a cis person is considered the standard. Thank you for this question about AIDS activism. I like learning about the history of AIDS activism, especially as a lesbian, was just a big part of my journey. I don't have any particular thing to say about it, but I do have a friend in Gaza who is HIV positive and remains anonymous. And if anybody is like interested in supporting that person, I might like send the fundraiser information to Claire so that, you know, you can like invest in the life of somebody who is living that experience on the ground. And thank you for your urgent tone, because it is urgent. It is an urgent situation. And I didn't talk too much about this actually at all today, but I am a psychotherapist. And I graduated right here from St. Paul University, Master's in Counseling and Spirituality. And this is a program that, you know, after 19 months has yet to say anything, not one thing, about the trauma, not only just inflicted on the people in Palestine on the ground, but also the, you know, sizable community of Palestinians and Arabs that live right here in this city. And the mental health culture and the culture of these psychology professions is acting as if nothing at all is wrong in the world. Nothing at all. And certainly Palestinians, we don't exist to the mental health framework. And so, but I also think at the same time is that if we felt the freedom to go and scream, if everybody was actually felt a natural inclination to express their emotion about the horror of this moment and the urgency of this moment, we could disrupt all of society with that energy. You know, and that's exactly what they don't want. They don't want people feeling too deeply, because then we would all go and we would riot, you know, to bring it back to rioting. So, yeah, right. Thank you.
That's all for me.
Okay, so we'll take three more. We're gonna start with an online question. So Yipen, could you pass the mic to Connor? She can share with us what's being asked online.
Hello. Okay, yes, thank you. Quick shout out to while you folks have been answering questions with each other in the room, they've been doing the very scary thing of doing it with each other on the chat. And they've been chitty-chatting in the chat. I don't know if you can see how many there are, but there's many, many chat comments. So quick shout out to the folks on the Zoom. 98, yeah. And so a question that someone wanted to ask was, I was wondering if you folks could speak to the ongoing discussions surrounding bubble bylaws in Ottawa and Toronto, which if you didn't hear that on Zoom, there were lots of yeses, which are being used to suppress pro-Palestine organizing, but also claiming to protect children from transphobic protests at school. How do we address folks who are concerned about the surge in attacks on queer youth while upholding our fundamental right to protest?
Right, thank you. So there's our first question. You want to run around, Sir Yipeng? So we've got a hand up here.
Okay, is this working? Okay, cool. So I wrote this down just because it'd be easier for me to remember. But one of the questions.
You could just hold the mic a bit closer to ya.
Oh yeah. So one of the questions that you touched on in the panel was how to build powerful strategies in the liberation movement. So for especially those in the room who are more recently radicalized into supporting queer and trans people and Palestinians, how do we build said strategies outside of electoralism? And I'm asking this because when queer people fought for marriage equality and won, there was a semblance of an electoral left. I mean, that's frankly non-existent now, especially just one example being the Ontario NDP throwing out Sarah Gem, a Black disabled member of provincial parliament, for being out of line and speaking out against the genocide. And there's also the cynical use of queer people and other marginalized groups by neoliberal political parties in order to gaslight us and say, see, we are actually progressive. You know, and these people are often forced to toe the neoliberal party line as well. I mean, just look at like AOC, for example.
All right, and we'll go to the person in the green in the middle. Yipeng, can you see? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, my question is about coalition building across political lines. So we've heard a lot tonight about how that's really necessary in order for us to get the numbers and the power that we need to actually be a force to be reckoned with. And I'm wondering about just practically, how does that look for activists, organizers who their identity is, something that is actively disliked or disagreed with, for instance, by the people that they're trying to build coalition with? Like, what does that actually look like? Do you have to sort of put aside your identity, say you're a trans organizer and you're trying to build coalition with people who are actively anti-trans for whatever reasons, either because of propaganda, their culture, whatever they have been told? How does that look, and how do you practically strategize around building those coalitions without sort of doing that disservice to yourself in your identity?
All right, I believe we have our three. Take it away, whoever would like to.
I'll be kind of brief if that's possible for me. Maybe just starting from the last question. I think it is a complex one, and I think like coalition building is super important and essential. But I think also a precondition of it is for us to get organized within our own communities, right? I think often when we think of how we're going to go out and change hearts and minds, like, one of the kind of common ways we think of it is like, we can't shy away from hard conversations at the dinner table, right? Like we have to have that difficult conversation with our, intolerant uncle. like stuff like that. And I think that's real. That's not nothing. But I think when we're talking about like organizing and power and certainly coalition building, we need to first make sure that we have more of an articulated strategy and a level of discipline and organization internally. And I think as queer community, we really lack this, you know, like in many cities and in many contexts, like we don't have that kind of robust sense of like, we're very interconnected as community in various ways, you know, our communities are very all tangled up together, but we're not organized in the sense that like we are in organizing relationships that then make it possible for us to take a collective action and to know and to test and to measure how many people do we have in this city tonight in Ottawa, for example. I know there's lots of queers who stand for Palestine and who stand with Palestine. I saw it last year at Capitol Pride. But if you ask me tomorrow to say, I'm going to do a phone zap to Capitol Pride to say, we want you to go further this year on Palestine solidarity, I want to be able to say, I know that there will be 500 or 1,000 or 3,000 phone calls going straight to the Capitol Pride board. I can't say that right now. I don't know. I have no idea. I'll just be taking a guess. So that's what I mean when I say organization internally. And then when we talk about coalition building, again, it's not on every single person in the community. And I really do think like, you know, it is that difficult work where, you know, in all of the work that we do, and I organize in a lot of contexts that are outside of queer and trans space. And, you know, as a trans woman, like that requires navigating a lot of like pretty complex things. And I know my thresholds, and I know kind of some of the things that I need to take care of myself and to be cared for by my community, that make certain things possible. And it's important also to know what are those things that aren't going to be possible for you. So that's all really difficult work, but it's also to say that like coalition building is often going to be happening at the level of organizations to organizations, and not necessarily like at that kind of individualized level of going out and having really difficult talks. Maybe I'll leave the other questions, but just wanted to say that.
All right, I'll switch over to this microphone. I think in terms of, I mean, I'm going to say kind of almost the opposite of what you just said about it. I not to disagree with you, I actually agree with you, but I think one of the things that I'll say what we did in Montreal. So before the genocide started, there was the parental rights movement, and a bunch of us organized around it. And we had like a signal group, and there was a group of people from across sectors in Montreal who were working together. And you don't go after the ideologically driven like leaders of a movement who are part of, you don't go for the people who are like the most bigoted and the hardest line people. You go for the people who you kind of know already, people who you might have like interacted with or organized with in another context. And you have conversations with those people, and you share what is difficult about their participation in something that's happened, and ask them like why they wanted to do that and why that was important for them, and try and actually listen. And those are actually the really powerful conversations that happen with people who are like leaders in their groups and their communities, but are not necessarily leaders of like the specific action that's going on. And that was really effective because we knew that there were a couple people who were members of the community that had attended that demonstration. People were really hurt by their participation. And we didn't send the people who were the most like affected, who are the most like triggered by that encounter. We sent people who felt like they could hold space for having a hard conversation. And that's the key here. It's like, it's not for you as an individual to have individual one-on-one conversations with every person you know. It's building a collective capacity to hold space for each other, to lean on one another, and build a collective response to be able to find the right kinds of conversations to have with the right kinds of people, and slowly build those relationships over time. And that means having conversations with people who you know are maybe participating in things that you don't agree with, or that challenge or threaten, you know, your life and your experience in the world, and holding space for that. And in the Palestine movement, one of the ways that I do that is I hold space for Zionists. Like, It's not popular to do it, but I do. I hold space for Zionists. I let them ask their questions in events, at talks, afterwards. I have conversations with people. I give them some of my time in those contexts and talk through some of the things that they're expressing and feeling. I offer some validation sometimes about what they're sharing, about their own fears, and I give them another perspective from the one that they currently have. And I think that that's important coalition work, actually, in those moments. And I have to say, I've had some really powerful encounters. I don't know if they're life-changing encounters for the people who I've interacted with, but they've been life-changing for me in a way. And I think those are the kinds of moments that building our collective capacity to hold space for that kind of work is going to be what allows us to bridge some of those gaps that have prevented us from being able to build a large-scale collective capacity. Because I think for the most part, over the last 40 years, we've been mostly divided. We've been really divided by structures of power, and it has pitted us against one another because scarcity does that, precarity does that. It makes people in competition for rights recognition discourses, for access to resources. And the reality is that we're not really in competition with one another. We're in competition with a structure that has created a deficit life for people. So those are, I think, some of the key components of that. And I think that speaks a little bit to the kind of context of the electoral system. We don't have a lot of critical capacity of electoral politics to change the world, but what we do have are neighborhood groups. The neighborhood groups have been incredibly powerful in mobilizing against the complicity of their MPs in parliament. And even the ones that are the most staunch have had their lives really affected by the mobilizing that's happened by their constituents. And that's one kind of example or illustration of the way that a movement can engage and interact with a system that's really not designed to be able to respond in a way that is liberatory or transformative, but that challenges the status quo. And I think that's the pretty key thing here. As we're building capacity, we need to be challenging the status quo that takes for granted that these systems and structures are to the benefit of the majority of people, and really help our communities understand the way that we've not benefited from those systems, and help really hold the people who have taken representational roles feel responsibility and accountable to those decisions and their participation in those systems. And that probably won't change things completely, but allowing people to feel more empowered to participate in movements is really key and important right now. And which means that we need approaches to movement work that allow people to slowly build their capacity over time and not allow people to burn out too quickly. And this is I think right now in the movement, one of the things we're really struggling with is that people went really hard, really strong, and people are burnt out. A lot of people are burning out. And that's something that I think we also need to think about how to build scale and also understand longevity. One of the things that I told some of my students is that we're not going to likely see, it's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. We're not going to see a free Palestine this year. It's not going to, it's been a long time, and it's going to be a long time still until we see this. We have to be in this for the long struggle. The same way we have to be in for the long struggle for climate crisis. We have to be in the long struggle for Indigenous rights. We have to be in the long struggle for anti-racist work, disability justice work. This is not short-term struggles. It's not something that we could commit a year of our life to and then it's done. This is lifelong work, which means we need to build a lot of critical capacity and skill building slowly over time. And I know we don't have the luxury of time, but it's actually the only thing that we'll be able to do. So find ways that allow you to build capacity in your own life. Find people that you can connect with who help you feel like you can build capacity with them, and also build some really good transferable skills, like communication and conflict resolution skills. Those are really helpful in every component, and it's the one thing that the most of us don't have, myself included. I didn't come into this world with a good foundation in those things. It took a lot of work learning some basic things, and there's still a lot of avoidance going on. So I'm not saying that I'm an expert on this, but it's definitely something that we need to be able to do. We need to be able to hold space for the hard things and to be able to figure out how to work through them and help other people alongside us do that. We can't afford to live in a context anymore where we just cut each other out. Like we just can't, it's not going to be viable or feasible anymore because the infrastructure is not there anymore. You're not going to be able to like get through life without the people that are hard to get along with in our own lives and especially in our movements, you know? And so that means finding ways not to like have it destroy the movement or undermine our capacity to do movement work, but how to grapple with the fact that there's going to be a lot of difference and we have to hold space for that difference and also still build capacity and do something. So those are like the kind of big kind of thoughts about these questions. And I feel like I forgot another one, but I'm so sorry. It was the online one. I don't know.
It's okay. I think
Yeah.
we'll pass it to our comrade Maria and then, yeah. Thank you though. That was chef's kiss.
Thank you both so very much. I don't have much to say on this question, honestly, because I recognize the difference between the questions being asked are questions about organizing and about power. And I know what I am, skilled at and what I am not. And anyone who has tried to work with me knows that my brain is like scrambled eggs from the trauma of this whole, being Palestinian thing. But what I can add to this is, the concept of people are burning out, and something I find really like silly that people say to me who like learned about Palestine like 2 years ago. They'll be like, well, we failed. And I'm like, this has been 100 years. It's 100 years, and we're not going to bring down an occupation in 2 years, but we are growing. We did that big push. A lot of us burnt out. How we talk about what we're going to do moving forward, the questions everyone is asking, I was like, yes, when you talk in the movement, talk with, like a, what do you call it? A growth mindset. Okay, we tried some stuff and we're not where we want to be. What's next? There are so many avenues. Like you two just named, like, I can't even count on two hands all the ideas you just named. So bring an energy of resilience and reject defeatism at every turn, because there is work to do and we can't afford to act like, oh, we tried everything. So good luck, I guess. Sorry, Palestine, Nah, this is lifelong work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end the Q&A and we're just going to move to our action pieces now. But folks will be here after if you want to come in and chat. So Connor, if you could just pop it to the next slide. If you got the piece of paper when you came in that has the pass for action, please pull it out. If you didn't get it, please raise your hand and we will pass you one. We've also got them on the screen here. What we are asking folks to do is take a look and choose one suggested action. Commit to taking this action within 1 month of today. And once you've done it, check in with a friend about it, about how it went. So let's just take a look at the actions. Connor, can you go to the next one? All right, so 1, go through the resources provided for tonight's event. Once you have, share with at least one friend. 2, share what you learned tonight with 3 people who couldn't or wouldn't be here tonight. Prime opportunity for a messy conversation as suggested by our panelists. 3, find and expose yourself to queer Palestinian writing, music, and other cultural experiences. 4, read the calls from Queers Coalition for Palestine and Queers in Palestine and take one action item from this list. We've got those calls in photocopy version on our table out there. Join in organizing Palestine solidarity for this year's Capital Pride, number 5. Next slide, please, my dear. 6, organize a discussion about this topic in a queer and or trans organization you're part of. 7, begin or continue work to get a queer or trans organization you're part of to sign on to the BDS call. And queer and trans organizations are considered cultural organizations, right? So it's all part of this cultural boycott. 8, with 1 or 2 friends or with an organization you're part of, take action for BDS by leafleting, stickering, or otherwise pressuring businesses and organizations that sell Israeli products or work with Israeli companies and institutions. A good place to start to find this info is bdsmovement.net. 9, get involved in the campaign for a total arms embargo. We've got folks from Palestine Solidarity Ottawa Center here tonight that you could chat with at their table outside. And then, of course, your own idea, because this movement is beautiful and diverse and magical and kaleidoscopic. So maybe you have your own idea. So we are just hoping that folks will take the knowledge to a place of action. So take this with you, share it with folks, commit to your action. We want to say thank you to all of the organizations that endorsed and supported this event. You can see all of their logos on the screen when we get the new slide coming up. Keep going, Connor. Keep going. There we go. Debaser, Queers for Palestine, Ottawa Trans Library, Labor for Palestine, Faculty for Palestine, IJV Ottawa, Palestine Solidarity Ottawa Center, University of Ottawa and Carleton University Joint Chair in Women's Studies, and Ottawa Healthcare Professionals for Palestine. We also have a bunch of amazing humans we want to thank. Ryan, Adam, Connor, Carlin, Amanda, Dan, Anik, Mac, Namrata, Jasmine, Casey, Christina, Pierre, Maša, and Meadow and Max Ottawa. Thank you. Let's give them a hand. Connor, can you just go back to, no, next one. So if you want to support the work of our collective, we get this question sometimes for folks who want to. There's a few ways that you can. You can sign up to our mailing list and follow us on Instagram to stay in touch, keep track of what we're doing, attend our events, share our resources with folks. So we have a whole bunch on our link tree and it's there. It's also linked through our Instagram. If you can connect us with free or low cost spaces, photocopying, black and white, color, amazing. We love that. And if you want to send us a donation, it's basically just to cover space rentals, printing, all that kind of stuff that goes into organizing events. You can send us an e-transfer at our address there, educationforliberation@protonmail.com. So we have a bunch of resources out there. Please check them out. We got free zines. We have posters for sale by donation. And the last thing we want to do is do a closing chant. So Connor, can you find where it says the chant? There it is. No pride in genocide and Israeli apartheid. Let me hear you. No pride in genocide and Israeli apartheid. No pride in genocide and Israeli apartheid. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. Take care. Till next time.